Hi, my name is Sin. Welcome back to my channel. On my channel, I love to talk about female directors and other women in Hollywood that are trailblazing the industry. This week's episode of the podcast is about the film Outrage that came out in the 1950s. And here is a little synopsis. Yeah, I came prepared with notes. Directed by the groundbreaking Ida Lupino, this raw and uncompromising film plunges into the psychological aftermath of a violent assault. Anne Walton finds her world unequivocally fractured by a late-night rape, leaving her incapable of facing the sympathy or judgment of her family and fiancé. Adopting a new name, she escapes to the isolated safety of a rural orange grove. But this offers no real shield. As a compassionate clergyman attempts to break through her emotional wall, a sudden and terrifying confrontation with a coworker forces her to relive her trauma, resulting in an arrest for attempted murder. The ensuing legal battle strips away her assumed identity and puts her torment on public display, forcing the court to confront the difficult question of whether her crime was an act of malice or a cry of desperation. I watched this film last night. I loved it. It literally, I don't know why I had never heard of it before or seen it before, but I loved it. I feel like this is such a classic and it's something that definitely needs to be taught in film school. Like, it was so cinematic and there were elements of it that I feel like were pioneering for its time, especially the subject matter, the cinematography. I don't know, it was just kind of like groundbreaking, especially considering when it was filmed, right? I will say this though, it is a film that if you are a survivor of sexual assault, it can be a little triggering, just because even though it doesn't show the actual rape happening, and it never mentions the word rape, and you never see it happen, because it deals with the aftermath and it deals with like the emotional turmoil that the victim is kind of going through after the assault. That can be triggering for a victim. I know for me it was a bit triggering just because it just felt so real and raw and authentic, her experience with trying to integrate into society again, or trying to face her fiance, or trying to have like an intimate relationship with him again post assault, or going to the police and reliving the trauma while she's trying to pick her assailant out of a lineup, or the fact that like a coworker came on to her and he was a little pushy, and it kind of just like triggered her and made her feel like the assault was happening all over again. And so if you're not in a good place to watch this, even though it's pretty censored and you never see the actual attack, I would just have some discernment, see where you are, put some feelers out to see if you're ready for this topic as a survivor. But I would just, trigger warning, it can be very emotional, But overall, it's a really great film. I feel like the fact that we got a film in the 50s by a female director talking about such a heavy topic that a lot of men, even now in the big 2025, refuse to acknowledge, take seriously. And the fact that the Epstein files still are not released in October of 2025 is a testament, to the fact that even now in the 21st century, women are not believed. Even years after their assault, they still don't really get justice, and their assailants sometimes even walk free, even in death, So the fact that this woman in the 1950s was, making films around this topic and showcasing it in a very emotional way really speaks to the kind of power she had for the time. And I want to get into her, the director. Ida Lupino. Here's just like a little background about her. She was a British American actress, writer, producer, and director who became famous and most prominent for her filmmaking work in Hollywood during the 1950s and for her acting career. She was a highly successful actress, earning fame in great film noirs and dramas like They Drive by Night, High Sierra, and she often played strong, worldly, and unstable characters. Sorry, my dogs are like, I don't know, they're kind of just like anxious. I don't know, like they just want to be like running around and sniffing, and even though it's like 2 a.m. when I'm recording this, and they should be asleep, because they heard me in my studio, they wanted to be around, but they also aren't sleepy. I don't know. They're kind of just with me. Hopefully they settle in for the night. Okay. I do want to also talk about the cultural context in which this film was made. When it was released, it was under the Hays Code at the time, which censored and made so many things like bad, and like you can't speak about it or show it. And so this is why in the movie we never see the assault happening. Not that I want that can, sometimes it doesn't really need to be seen, like we don't need to see that. But also after the fact, they never called it rape. They always said the violent assault, right? And this is a result of kind of that censorship. And this is also why the main focus of the movie is not so much the assault, but the aftermath and the emotional turmoil that the victim is in, and why there's such a heavy emphasis on her emotional state and her emotional journey. And it's honestly crazy for me to see decades later the fact that society really hasn't changed that much. We still victim blame. We still put so much pressure on the victim. Still now, so many rape cases go unsolved. They don't get followed up. The rapists don't really get convicted. It's really sad to see. It happened in the 50s and it's still currently happening now. And I know a lot of people say, well, why didn't you just report it? This film came out in the 50s and she literally reported it that night. Like hours after the assault. A doctor and a detective went to her home, questioned her, examined her that night. And it still didn't really go anywhere. And then by the end of the movie, she was the one on trial for attempted murder because she reacted, like, because she was triggered because this guy was coming on way too strong and she felt like she had to defend herself. So it's crazy that she made this film in the 50s, and decades later, the narrative has not changed. And women still are put in the hot seat for their own assaults, and they're the ones treated like perpetrators and not victims. And they're not helped, and they're not listened to, and they're not advocated for, and they're not getting justice the way that they deserve. And their assailants are walking free most of the time, which is really sad to see. But I'm really glad that this director was brave enough and, was lucky enough to make a film like this with this much cultural impact. I don't know how it was received in the 50s. I don't think it was received well just because of the taboo subject matter and the fact that the protagonist was a woman, kind of going through something very personal. And I don't know why that doesn't seem to be something that movie executives tend to like funding, but I'm really glad it was. And it reminded me of this movie that came out, I think this year, called Sorry Baby. Let me find out who that director is, because I watched it and I really liked it, and it really tugged at my heartstrings as a survivor. Yeah, it came out this year, and it's by director Eva Victor. It came out June of this year. And it's about this woman who was in college and she was assaulted by her professor. And it didn't really go anywhere. And it's kind of just like her journey. It's not really told linearly. It's kind of like her journey before. It's like her story before the assault, during the assault, and then after the assault. And it's just kind of like a very just raw, emotional, contemporary story of the same kind of, subject matter of outrage. And I feel like we all should see it. It's kind of crazy to think about the fact that things really haven't changed for women decades later, and that we're still making commentary films about our assaults, and the fact that justice doesn't really get served for us, and it's still a fight that we're fighting to this day. That being said, I am not pessimistic. I think that these movies are important. I feel like when we make movies like this as women, we show other women that they're not alone. and that we're going through similar things, and that it's kind of advocating that we need to change. We need to change our legislation. We need to change the way that we societally see assault. I do think that we are stepping in the right direction, using the word rape more often. I feel like back then it was just like seen as something that happens like in Outrage. It's something that happens by a stranger, and it's vicious and it's unpredictable, and it happens in alleyways, right? But a film years later, like Sorry Baby, it shows that it primarily happens with intimate partners, you know, people that you know in your day-to-day life, your friends, your boyfriends, your professors, co-workers, colleagues. It happens with people that you know well, and that's the complicated part of it. It's not something that happens with a boogeyman in a dark alley, you know, late one night in downtown, right? It's something that happens in classrooms, bedrooms, churches. It's something that happens with people that you have established relationships with and that you trust, you know, that you don't think would ever do something to hurt you because you thought that they had some level of love for you. And I think that's a big step in the right direction with these kind of subject and this kind of topic. Yeah, those are my thoughts on it. Please check it out. I actually watched this whole thing on YouTube. I'm going to link it below because I feel like it's a great movie. When I was in film school, we studied a lot of men. And so I feel like this is such a great film. It was so well put together, and it deserves to be up there with one of the classics. So instead of like Alfred Hitchcock, I feel like it needs to be up there with Alfred Hitchcock. She is an amazing director. I'm going to watch more of her movies because she seemed like she was just like a trailblazer in the industry. But we are making strides. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know by liking this podcast. I really appreciate it. I would love to keep doing this. I have a lot of fun doing it, and I want to keep sharing amazing women that are changing Hollywood, whether it was in the 50s or currently. If you have any movies that you want me to review that were directed by women, please let me know, comment below, reach out to me on email. As always, thank you so much for watching or listening, whichever format you're consuming this in. I really appreciate you spending some time with me on my corner of the internet, and I love you. See you next time. Bye.